Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 56 of the ITSM crowd, take 2. So take 1, we had internet gremlins, which was unfortunate. We were just digging into the topic of site reliability engineering when everybody's faces froze and the internet gods cursed us. So we're back again. I'm joined by Jason Hand and Doug Tedder. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their background. So Doug, if you could kick us off, please.
And just like last week, it threw me off because I'm on the right side of the screen and not the left, but nevertheless. So, no, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Doug Tedder, and I am the owner and principal consultant for Tedder Consulting. Been doing service management consulting for about 10 years, the last 6 or so on my own. And really looking forward to today's conversation. SRE is something I've been trying to dig into a little bit. And so I'm looking forward to talking with Jason and Claire and really exploring this topic a bit.
Thank you so much. And Jason.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. My name's Jason Hand, and I am a cloud advocate at Microsoft. So I spend most of my time focusing on helping people kind of understand the principles behind site reliability engineering and sort of building resilient systems, but mostly cloud focused, of course. And before that, before being part of the Microsoft gang, I was over at a company called VictorOps, which provided on-call and incident management. And so it's kind of really there where I probably, I guess, spent most of my time really thinking about SRE types of principles, regardless to even if that's what they were called, but just how do we build and sort of operate and maintain these highly reliable systems, or when I say reliable, like people really do rely on them. And so we have to kind of focus on how do we provide that. So anyway, really excited to be part of this conversation, and thank you for the invite, Claire.
No problem. Thank you so much. And my name's Claire Agutter. I'm the host on today's session. And just to remind you that we will be watching Twitter throughout this broadcast. So we'll be live for 30 minutes. If you've got any questions that you want to put to Jason or to Doug, pop them onto Twitter with the hashtag ITSMcrowd. We will pick them up and we will answer them. But Jason, I want to come to you first and just define SRE for me, because it's always nice to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and there's a lot of terminology to keep up with at the moment in the IT world. So talk to me about what SRE actually is.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I always love to help sort of explain an acronym. I feel like there's always a new acronym every day. So, but for those of you who are not familiar, SRE stands for Site Reliability Engineering. And at least at Microsoft, we've sort of come to an agreement on what we feel best describes site reliability engineering. And although there are site reliability engineering teams or orgs or even site reliability engineers, we feel that it's actually an engineering principle that sort of applies to the whole life cycle of building apps and infrastructure and services and all these different things that provide some sort of value to someone. So it's something that everybody has to think about. But there's a couple of different, I guess, properties about SRE that we like to remind people. And one of them is that we're looking to help organizations pretty much find sustainable or sustainably achieve what we call appropriate levels of reliability. And the appropriate is sort of a twist for a lot of people, because most commonly people like to think about absolute uptime, as many nines as we can. You hear about like 5 nines of reliability or availability. And sometimes that makes sense, but sometimes it doesn't. So really kind of level setting on what is an appropriate level of reliability, but then also understanding that the term reliability itself isn't just about uptime. It isn't just about getting a response back from a service. It could have something more to do with, yes, certainly latency, but also is the sort of the data set that you have, is it able to sort of churn through the data like you expect it to? So reliability has a lot to do with just what do you expect your system or your services to do, and how do we measure that kind of thing. So moral of the story here is that site reliability engineering is sort of a big topic and means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and it is something that all of us, as whether we're software engineers or just someone involved with providing a digital service, it's something that all of us have to think about.
That's good, thank you. I've been kind of hearing SRE more and more, and I saw a presentation at Leeds DevOps recently that was talking a bit about what SRE is. And the thing that I guess made my ears prick up a little bit was the DevOps events I've been to, DevOps Enterprise Summit, DevOps meetups, DevOps days. Quite a lot of them still felt like they had a fairly strong dev focus, and the sort of percentage of dev talks compared to ops talks was a little bit skewed. And to me, this started to feel like a bit more focus on ops, and there were kind of service management terms in there that I recognised. Is that something that you think is a sort of a correct understanding?
I would say yes and no. I feel like traditionally a lot of the things that get rolled up into the responsibility of providing uptime and providing high availability has been sort of put on or placed on the shoulders of ops-minded people, system administrators and operations teams, and service owners and those types of things. But as we've kind of moved into more of a DevOps world, those lines between those teams get blurred a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And so it's really less about, these sort of old sort of mindsets about division of work, or, just sort of splitting up who was responsible for what. There's now an ownership that has been sort of spread out through all of the teams, whether you sort of identify as a developer, identify as something else, that all of us have to work on. And so I think, I'm not sure if we'll have time to get to it, but like the conversation about putting developers on call has received a lot of pushback. But that's typically in an organization who they really do have separation of duties, where these are our developers and that's all they do is just write code for these services. And then there's our operations teams who they're responsible for the production environments and building those and keeping those healthy. But in a DevOps environment, once they've become more collaborative and once they've tried to remove anything in their value stream that's preventing them from pushing out value as quickly as possible, suddenly those lines become blurred. And I think you'll see in many cases, and I'm probably one of those too, where I try to go out of my way to say this is a responsibility, just like the definition of SRE, that all of us have to own. And if we continue to put these responsibilities on certain teams or orgs or individuals, then that's counter to what the whole DevOps thing is trying to do in the first place. So on one hand, I think you're right that there, some of these things like monitoring and stuff that was traditionally meant for an operations teams. Now I think in a DevOps model, they're realizing it's not so much. We have to start thinking about these things much earlier in the conversation. That's why you hear things like shifting security left, or shifting QA left, or shifting reliability left. It's because these are no longer concerns of the people at the end of the assembly line. There is no assembly line. This thing is constantly going. And so whatever concerns people have about the system in the production world, those conversations need to be put out and talked about in the early pre-planning world, where the production teams are saying, hey, I have an idea for a new piece of functionality. Immediately, we should start talking about how do we measure whether that new piece of functionality is delivering on any value. And that leads us to the appropriate ways of monitoring. So the way we used to do things, especially in an on-prem world, just don't really apply as much anymore. So that's why a lot of terms have fallen out of favor. That's why people are trying to get their teams to work together on the same teams, or be much more collaborative. So it's a little bit of yes, but the fact that you feel like it's kind of not fully there, I think is promising that the whole DevOps movement is actually, moving the needle.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And I really hope we don't fall into a world where we just stand up teams of SRE engineers and make it their problem. So I'm going to bring you in here, Doug, as well, because I know you've been seeing SRE coming up and reading into SRE. Why do you think this is an important topic right now?
Well, I think Jason kind of nailed it. I see SRE as this team ownership kind of thing. It is not an individual team, while organizations may have SRE engineers per se, but it really is, and I'm going to steal a term from DevOps, it's the product team that has to be involved with this, and that's everybody on that team. the thing I'm learning about SRE, and I'm going through the Google book, and the Google book is a fantastic book. It's basically a collection of case studies, so there's a little repetitiveness sometimes. It's not the most exciting read, but it's a great read. And the thing that comes back over and over and over is this collaboration that has to happen, and the thinking about, and Jason just kind of hit this, what is that end result, and we need to think about that right up front. I'm an old mainframer. I remember the days where we would try to retrofit monitoring and measuring at the end of the chain. Nearly impossible, if not is impossible. You can monitor the infrastructure kind of things fairly easily, but I liked what Jason said about the reliability of the data set and the reliability of the application. And these are things that if you don't build in right up front, you're not going to monitor them at the end, but yet they're critical for delivering those kinds of things. So that's kind of what's kind of piqued my interest into SRE, and why I think it is really a kind of a great way of looking at things, especially in this advent of the DevOps world.
Yeah, and I think the kind of the changes that things like SRE and Agile are driving are much bigger and much more fundamental than I guess sometimes we realize when we're talking about things like DevOps and SRE, like it's something we can just start and kind of be there next week. But I guess organizations like Microsoft, like VictorOps, they are very used to thinking in these kind of terms. But I wonder, Jason, if you could talk us through, I guess, some of the kind of the practicalities of SRE. So, things like error budgets, service level objectives. What are the things that organizations need to think about if they are much more new to these types of way of working?
Sure. Well, I'll start with service level indicators, or what are known as SLIs, and then there's service level objectives, which are SLOs. And both of those are intended, well, let me start with the SLIs. An SLI is intended to be a method to know at any given point in time, you'll have an indication of the current status of something. And whether that's latency that's coming into your service, or how many existing user requests you have, or how many people are logged in the system, it can vary in terms of what you're measuring, but it should be something that is indicative of what's important to the overall value that service is providing. So this is why it's not as important to like monitor at the component level, because it's much harder to draw a tie back to what is it like for Claire to do the thing that she's trying to do with our service, because that's really what's important. It's not so much is our CPUs all pegged. In fact, maybe that's okay. In a cloud world, you're paying for what you use, so maybe you want most of your CPUs at really high numbers, but as long as the people are doing what they're trying to do, then that's what's most important. So how can we create indicators that move us closer to that, where there's not all these multiple paths between the technical component and what our users are actually experiencing. So we've shifted away from old school monitoring and more towards putting something in place that gives us an indication of what it's really like across a bunch of different axes, with each axis having their own spectrum between of quality, good and bad. And so those are our service level indicators, and there's a lot of them. And then we take those service level indicators and sort of as a team or as an organization, we decide if we're going to be measuring these, and they kind of vary in terms of, 1 minute they're at, we'll just say a value of 100, and the next minute they're at a value of 25. What's quote normal, or what's okay for us? What are the bounds? Maybe that's a high and a low. Maybe it's sort of an average. But we have to say that if we're choosing latency as example, if latency at any given point in time, so based on our indicators, if it breaches what we say is our objective, our line in the sand, then at that point human beings need to be involved. Because we have just broken one of the very few rules we put in place that we're monitoring for sort of what's important for the end user. So if it breaks a threshold of latency has gotten to this point, then it's at that point engineers, and this is where the conversation of putting developers on call kind of comes in, because it's typically those developers who probably just pushed out the most recent feature know that code much better than anybody else. And so they should be at least part and parcel to the early response plan about what in the world's going on, because we've just seen a breach of our SLO. So that kind of covers real quickly, or as quickly as I can do it, what SLI and SLO are. And then you kind of hinted on error budget. And error budget would be saying that we're allowing ourselves over the course of a period, so let's say a quarter, we're allowing ourselves to have maybe 5% complete downtime of this one service. So this is where we have used our SLIs and our SLOs and established that over the quarter, we want to make sure we maintain 90% uptime. That leaves us with 10% headspace to allow for downtime. As an organization, we've all accepted that that's our little budget that we're willing to put up with. And so we can use that amount of time that's been agreed upon and allocated as time for research and development, or as time for providing, whatever it is you need to be more innovative. You don't have to put all of the resources into creating absolute uptime or having this facade of absolute uptime, creating sort of metrics that resemble that you've had absolute uptime, but in reality you haven't, because you weren't measuring other aspects of reliability. So I don't know if that was really covering all the bases, but error budgets we were actually kind of talking about this with Doug last week when we were having our first attempt at this. Is error budgets are one of the more sort of fascinating things for a lot of folks, because it's just that's not a way they've ever thought about services, is creating an actual like slop time in there to allow for innovation, like explicitly saying, yeah, we're good with downtime as long as you keep it within these bounds.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that the error budget does, at least from my perspective, we always have this ongoing conversation about the autonomy of a team, or the autonomy of people to make decisions at the level that and when you have an error budget, and to your point, Jason, you said, I've got a 10% error budget. The team now understands what that means, and the team can decide, hey, we need to slow down. We need to, we can't spend as much time here. We can't take that kind of risk, or we can. It really is kind of a great way of kind of getting the best of both worlds. You get the autonomy that the team needs and wants, but yet you give that overarching, here's how we're going to behave together and how we're going to work together. I like this concept of an error budget. I think it's just to me, it's one of the best things that's coming out of what I'm reading around SRE.
Yeah, and I think you do get this. There's still this frustration because IT is a new industry, and the sort of the less technical users of IT services have this frustration that comes out through the concept of control. And this is where you get your users asking for 5 nines, 6 nines, with very little understanding, I think, sometimes of what that actually means. And I think if we can express these terms to them, then it will help to move that conversation along. But I have a question really about how this is expressed with the fact that many of the kind of the online services that we use these days, there is such a gap between user and product teams. So if I think of the things that I'm using, at the moment I'm using Google Hangout, I've used my online banking today. I have no interaction with product teams there. So how does, from an SRE perspective, how are we working out what these objectives need to be, what acceptable looks like?
Totally. I think this is a great question. And this is where I think the product team people, like anyone who's associates as a product person, I think that their ears might perk up. And the example I'll use is when I was at VictorOps, we had created what we called the SRE Council. So rather than having an SRE team or SREs, we wanted individuals from literally every single org or every single team within the greater business to have a seat at the table of SRE and to bring forth their concerns. And so if you talk to somebody in product, one of their biggest concerns would be, hey, we're about to release this new feature, And I would love to know, how much usage are we getting out of it? Are people actually using it, first of all? Are they accomplishing what it is that it's set out to accomplish for them? Are they solving their problems? So there's all these things that, which those are still super important, maybe arguably more important to the business than some of the other things that we're used to monitoring for. So we talk to the product people and ask them, well, what is it you're really interested in knowing, or what is it you're terrified about? And then talk with our engineering team and figure out, well, how can we instrument the system to give us indications into that, and insight into what's going on, and move away from some of the other stuff. And so that allowed us to bring in people from sales and marketing, and really everybody in the whole business had a stake in SRE, because if you think about the reliability of VictorOps, or the reliability of any company, it's to provide a service and provide value. And so the non-technical people have strong opinions on what is something that's important to the overall value that we're trying to accomplish. And maybe it's, hey, at any given point, I want to make sure there's people actually logged into the system. Like if we go, 5 hours and nobody's in the system, shouldn't that be an indication that something's not right? Or at least maybe we should have this conversation. How many is too low, where we start to ring the bell and say, hey, somebody ought to look into this, because although everything on our dashboards looks green and no monitoring has alerted us to any problems, as a product person, I'm freaked out right now that we have 2 people in our system when maybe usually we're expecting more like 20,000. And that's just not something that I don't think an engineering team is going to be like, oh, you know what I should monitor for?
Yep.
They're just not going to do, that's not part of what they're measured on, or any concern that they're even remotely close to. So that's why it is important, and I think why it's dangerous oftentimes to think of SREs as just a rebranding of some old role. SRE is something we all, if we're trying to build a service or build a business that solves problems for people, shouldn't we be looking at whether or not those problems are being solved? And even if it's in a very abstract way, I think that's much better.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm going to kind of bring you in, Doug, because you're consulting at the moment. What sort of challenges are your customers facing that this could help them out with?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I see is it gives them the way to kind of codify some of the ways that we're going to engage, some of the ways that we're going to do business. I like, Jason's point. Too often it's engineers trying to make decisions on behalf of the business. You've got to have this wide swath of people engaged right up front. And we as an engineer, IT people like to engineer, and they like to solve problems that may or may not exist, or come up with things, right? And this, really starts to put the methodology, I'm going to use that term, in place that we get these folks engaged right up front, and we start to agree on what is good, and how does that look from your perspective? How does that look from your perspective? A lot of organizations I work with, they struggle with that, because they have a tendency to look at it only from the technology perspective. And the thing that I have picked up in SRE, and I'm still learning, it's more than just the technology. Yeah, it plays a key role, but it's not just technology. And so Jason kind of alluded to that just in his previous response.
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits when you get those engineers talking to the product people who are typically so far removed from one another, then the engineers suddenly feel more engaged in what in the world they're even doing with their lives. They're not just code monkeys who just show up and push buttons, and they actually are invested in solving people's problems if you'll allow them to be invested in that. But we still traditionally, kind of segment out who does what and how much they should know or need to know, and where their direction comes from, which is sadly still from the top down in a lot of cases. But if you can flip it around and say, hey, engineers, 1, 2, 3, we're trying to solve problems for people. And, Doug and I were talking about this last week too. All the smart people are at the bottom of the org chart. Maybe we should ask them how they think we should monitor it, rather than us pushing down ideas that frankly have always been incorrect. So this goes right to the heart of DevOps. Bring all those folks together to have the same conversation about what are we doing and why. And then SRE is just sort of a more implementation spin on the DevOps mindset.
Right, that's That's helpful, because I think one of the things I was interested to get out of this conversation is kind of how do SRE and DevOps fit together? Is SRE something that DevOps teams apply? You know, the two complementary ways of thinking. But I'm hearing that maybe SRE is a structure, I guess.
I think it has more structure than any DevOps sort of quote implementation would ever have, because for a lot of folks, DevOps isn't anything more than just continuous delivery and adding some more monitoring and things like that. When DevOps was never really intended to be such a prescriptive thing, we're just used to having a checklist of things to achieve certification or to do a thing is what we're used to having. And SRE is a little bit closer to giving you that prescriptive thing to scratch, like, okay, now I know I can create some SLIs. I can maybe explore this idea of error budgeting. I can actually, codify or taskify some of the things that DevOps encourages. I can actually quantify it and have some sort of qualitative measurement on it now. So it gives sort of wheels to a lot of the DevOps principles. But then I on the other hand, I have to flip it around and say, but please don't think that SRE is now just what DevOps is in its holistic mindset. Don't think this is just sort of the embodiment of DevOps. DevOps goes way beyond, sadly, just what the sort of mashup of Dev and Ops insinuates. It's really the business's concept of being more holistic and more systems thinking, and SRE is just kind of one little small aspect of it, but at least a part that I think is a super important aspect of it.
Yeah, and I can see, I do a lot of work in the kind of the service integration space across suppliers. I can see SRE bringing an advantage there, because it gives organizations something tangible to refer to if they're working together. So you're bringing in some common language, some common metrics across suppliers in a service network, and I think that's important as well. And that's something that it can be more challenging when we're applying this DevOps thinking.
Totally. I mean, DevOps is, I'm aware it's a very abstract thought. It's a very hippy dippy idea, but it's big thinking. It's not about technology. It's not about the process. It's about making those things so irrelevant that you don't box them into certain tools and technologies and how we get things done. But then SRE is at least one step away from that high-level abstract idea. I mean, it still is very abstract. I have yet to talk about any tools. I've yet to tell you how to create your SLIs, because it doesn't honestly matter. You have your own situation, so you'll have to do that yourself. So again, we're still at kind of a high abstract thinking place, and most people want to work their way closer to, damn it, Jason, just tell me what I'm supposed to do and how.
Yeah.
And that's like where I'm like, okay, we need to go back to square one, because that's the moment you think that that's how any of this is sustainable, we have to start over. So
that's where a lot of service management implementations go off the rails. Exactly that. Just tell me how. And it's not about that. It's about, to your point, working your way in.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm preaching now. I'll stop preaching.
Sorry, I got fired up.
So I think while while we're saying that we're not going to get prescriptive, for those people who watch this and think this sounds amazing, how do I get started? Where do I go to learn more? Are there any resources that you would point people to say, this is a good place to start?
Yeah, I mean, Doug already mentioned the Google SRE book that came out a number of years ago on O'Reilly. I think that's an excellent place to start. But as just about anybody who reads it will tell you, this is specific to Google and their own case situations, and they do a real good job of explaining why they made certain decisions. But I also fear that a lot of people just sort of, accept that and adopt their way of solving problems when none of us have Google problems. And
yes.
it's apples and oranges. So there's things that you can take from that book, but you shouldn't just follow it, to the step by step, which I don't think most people would. But it's good to know, I think, going in, because you're taking on, it's a huge project to read that book. Clear your schedule, because it's big. And then the next one is sort of a follow-up to that, actually, which a coworker of mine, David Blank Edelman, was a part of, also with O'Reilly, but it's called Seeking SRE. And so where the first book was really about Google's approach and a lot of the things that they were thinking about and how they came to certain decisions, this one goes over and it talks to folks at Spotify, and it talks to folks at Microsoft, and all these other well-known companies around the world who also have the same needs for highly reliable systems, but they've built they're not running on their own infrastructure like Google is, or they're not, they're just using different technology in general. So how do they do SRE, and what problems are they trying to solve for? So those are always my first two things that I suggest. And then in terms of just basic stuff, actually David also created this thing on, it's called Microsoft Learn, which is just part of Microsoft Docs. But there's a bunch of free courses you can take, and he created sort of an SRE 101 that goes through and explains what service level indicators are and objectives, and how to measure those, and all the different sort of aspects that go into reliability. So I think as far as a free resource, that's a really good one to point people to, and I can get you a link on that after the show if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Yeah, that's kind of where I start, pushing people. And then there's also a really great weekly zine or mailing list that comes out every week called SRE Weekly.
Okay.
Which is a kind of a curated list of a bunch of related blog posts that have come out that week, but also a list of all of the sort of well-known services out there or brands that have had some sort of outage or service disruption. There'll be either a blurb about each of them, or maybe even their post-incident retro summary. So some sort of like, post-mortem or something, they'll share that too. So it's a really great resource to just sort of have a pulse on the SRE world in general, I think.
Yeah. So perhaps, Claire, you can share that with your internet service provider. Just saying.
I think this is what happens when you do a Google Hangout with a Microsoft guest. I'm not sure who pulled the plug, but there you go.
I just wasn't really feeling it last week. I just didn't want to say it.
Better energy this week. So that's us. We're up to our 30 minutes. That has been, in one sense, I feel like we're just dipping a toe in the water, but in another sense, it's a really good introduction. So thank you so much to you, Jason, and Doug. Thank you for being here as well, and just sharing your thoughts on where you're seeing SRE popping up in the market as well. We will put a blog on ITSM Zone, and we'll include the links to the books, the Microsoft Learn, and hopefully where you can sign up for SRE Weekly as well. And the only other thing I need to do is just plug our next episode of the ITSM Crowd, because next Monday, so the 8th of July at 9 a.m. UK time, we are joined by Rob England, the IT skeptic, and Dr. Cherry Vu, who are going to be talking to us about their new book, The Agile Manager, and that's Agile very definitely with a small a. So thank you very much for watching. Jason and Doug, thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you on the next episode of the ITSM Crowd. Thanks, everyone.